September 28, 1944, Umurbrogol Mountain, Peleliu Island. The cave shook. Lieutenant Tadao Yamaguchi pressed his back against coral that had stood for 10,000 years and now radiated heat like a furnace wall. Outside, beyond the cave mouth, the world burned orange. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The sound arrived first. Not the sharp crack of artillery or the whistle of conventional bombs, but something different, a rushing roar like a typhoon made of fire. Then came the flash, brilliant, consuming, turning the afternoon jungle into a vision of hell. The F4U Corsairs screamed overhead at 200 feet, their distinctive inverted gull wings catching the sun, their massive Pratt and Whitney engines producing over 2,000 horsepower each. But it was what fell from their bellies that changed everything. Silver canisters tumbled end over end, 75-gallon napalm tanks that burst on impact, spraying jellied gasoline across the rocky ridges in waves of liquid fire. The flames didn't explode and fade like regular bombs. They stuck, they flowed. They burned at temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Celsius, hot enough to make steel weep. Yamaguchi had been told America was soft, wealthy, yes, industrially powerful, certainly, but lacking the spiritual strength, the willingness to endure, the warrior spirit that had sustained Japan for centuries. His training manual, issued by Imperial General Headquarters, had assured him that Americans relied on material superiority rather than spiritual incentive in battle, that their soldiers feared death and sought comfort, that Japanese determination would prove superior to American machines. The propaganda had not prepared him for this. For Corsairs that returned not once, not twice, but hour after hour, day after day, dropping fire from the sky, as if the wells of napalm would never run dry, as if America possessed not just more weapons, but infinite weapons. In February 1942, exactly 2 years and 7 months before that September afternoon on Peleliu, a different kind of fire had been born. Not in the Pacific, not in preparation for island warfare, but in the basement of Converse Laboratory at Harvard University. Professor Louis Fieser, a 42-year-old organic chemistry professor, had mixed aluminum naphthenate and aluminum palmitate with gasoline, creating a gel consistency that would change the nature of aerial warfare forever. Fieser called it napalm, a portmanteau of naphthenic and palmitic acids. The jellied gasoline achieved something conventional incendiaries could not. It stuck to surfaces, it burned longer. And most critically, for the coming Pacific War, it could be delivered by fighter aircraft, not just heavy bombers. The M69 incendiary bomb, each weighing 6.2 pounds and containing jellied gasoline, could spray across a 15-foot diameter. When delivered by fighter bombers in repeated strikes, napalm transformed tactical air support into something unprecedented. But the weapon was only half the equation. The delivery system arrived in the form of the Vought F4U Corsair, one of the most remarkable fighter aircraft ever designed. First flown on May 29, 1940, the Corsair represented American engineering at its zenith. Its Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, driving a massive 13-foot propeller through an innovative inverted gull-wing design that provided ground clearance while keeping the landing gear short and strong. The Corsair could fly faster than 400 miles per hour, making it the first single-engine American fighter to exceed that speed. Armed with 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, it compiled an 11-to-1 kill ratio in air-to-air combat against Japanese fighters. But by 1944, the Corsair had evolved beyond its original role as an interceptor. It had become a fighter bomber capable of carrying 2,000-pound bombs, rockets, and critically, napalm tanks. The marriage of napalm and Corsair occurred gradually through 1943 and early 1944. Marine squadrons in the Marshall Islands independently began mounting centerline racks for bombs. Navy ground crews of VF-17 improvised bomb pylons. Charles Lindbergh, working as a civilian aviation advisor in the Pacific, demonstrated on September 3, 1944, that a Corsair could carry 3,000 pounds of ordnance, 3 1,000-pound bombs simultaneously. By the time American forces prepared to assault Peleliu in September 1944, the tactical integration was complete. Corsairs based on escort carriers offshore could deliver napalm strikes with precision, supporting marine infantry at close range. And unlike heavy bombers operating from distant bases on carefully planned missions, these fighter bombers could respond rapidly, repeatedly, relentlessly. The logistics behind this capability revealed the true nature of American industrial power. By mid-1944, the United States was producing 8 million pounds of napalm annually. Dow Chemical had ramped up production to industrial scale. The M69 bombs were being manufactured by the hundreds of thousands. Most critically, the supply chain functioned with mechanical efficiency. Napalm produced in American factories flowed across the Pacific to forward bases, then to escort carriers and captured airfields, delivering fire to Japanese positions with the regularity of a factory production line. This was the system Lieutenant Yamaguchi faced on Peleliu. Not individual acts of courage or isolated demonstrations of technological prowess, but systematic, industrial-scale application of firepower. The Corsairs that struck his position on September 28th were not flying exceptional missions. They were flying standard close air support sorties, part of a routine that would repeat throughout the 73-day battle for Peleliu. Japanese military doctrine in 1944 had not accounted for this reality. The Imperial Japanese Army's strategic thinking centered on Seishin's spiritual power as the ultimate battlefield factor. This philosophy emerged from calculated necessity as much as cultural tradition. Japan's steel production in an entire year equaled what America produced in a single month. The solution, Japanese strategists concluded, was to make each soldier superior in areas where industrial capacity did not matter: night infiltration, close combat, willingness to die rather than surrender. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commander of Peleliu's garrison, represented this evolved defensive doctrine. Unlike earlier Pacific battles where Japanese forces contested the beaches directly, Nakagawa had studied the American victories at Tarawa and Saipan. He understood that confronting American firepower at the waterline meant certain annihilation. Instead, he developed a defense in depth, using Peleliu's unique coral ridges to create a fortress that would make every yard cost American lives. The Umurbrogol Mountain, which Marines would call Bloody Nose Ridge, contained over 500 caves connected by tunnels. These positions were carefully sited to provide mutual support, interlocking fields of fire, and protection from naval bombardment. Nakagawa's 14,000 troops, primarily from the experienced 14th Infantry Division, had spent months preparing these defenses. They had stockpiled ammunition, established command posts deep in the coral, and prepared for a battle of attrition that would bleed American forces white. What Nakagawa had not fully anticipated was the tactical evolution of American air power. The strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities would eventually dominate headlines and historical memory. But in the daily grinding combat on Pacific Islands, close air support by fighter bombers like the Corsair proved equally transformative. These aircraft could strike positions within yards of friendly troops, could respond within minutes to requests for support, and could deliver their ordnance with accuracy that heavy bombers could not match. Peleliu provided the testing ground for these tactics. When the 1st Marine Division landed on September 15, 1944, they expected to secure the island in 4 days. Major General William Rupertus, the division commander, had assured his troops the battle would be quick. The preliminary bombardment, 3 days of naval gunfire and aerial bombing, appeared to have devastated Japanese defences. Rupert's prediction proved catastrophically wrong. The Marines advanced inland from the beaches into a meat grinder. Nakagawa's troops, hidden in their coral fortresses, allowed the Americans to penetrate deep before opening fire from concealed positions. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery struck from caves that naval bombardment had barely touched. By nightfall on D-Day, the 1st Marine Division had suffered over 1,100 casualties, including 200 killed. The predicted 4-day battle had barely begun. This was the moment when close air support proved its value. By the second day, September 16th, Marine Corsair Squadron VMF 114 landed on the captured Peleliu airfield, even as fighting raged in the hills above. Within hours, these Corsairs were conducting strikes against Japanese positions barely hundreds of yards from marine lines. The napalm they carried transformed the tactical situation. Conventional high-explosive bombs could destroy a bunker if they scored a direct hit. Artillery could suppress positions temporarily. But napalm could flow into cave systems, consuming oxygen, creating temperatures that made reinforced concrete crack and steel melt. Marine, forward air controllers, positioned with frontline units, could call in napalm strikes with unprecedented speed. A Corsair could take off from Peleliu's airfield, deliver its napalm load, and return to rearm in less than 20 minutes. This meant continuous pressure, unrelenting fire, systematic destruction of defensive positions that would have required days of infantry assault to reduce. For Japanese defenders like Lieutenant Yamaguchi, this represented a form of warfare beyond their conceptual framework. The training that emphasized spiritual power over material means, that promised victory through superior will, offered no answer to an enemy who could deliver fire from the sky, hour after hour, without apparent limit. Each napalm strike demonstrated not just American technological capability, but American industrial capacity, the ability to produce, transport, and deliver vast quantities of advanced weapons as if from an inexhaustible supply. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate horror of burning alive. It was the relentlessness that corroded morale. Japanese soldiers had proven throughout the Pacific War that they could endure extraordinary hardship, could fight to the last man when honor demanded it. But fighting against an enemy who possessed not just superior weapons, but apparently infinite quantities of those weapons created a different kind of despair. If the Americans could drop napalm all day today, and all day tomorrow, and all next week, what did courage matter? What did determination achieve? If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The answer came in the coral caves of Umurbrogol Mountain during the first week of October, 1944. By this point, the battle for Peleliu had consumed 3 weeks. The Marines had secured the airfield, the southern portion of the island, and the flatter terrain. But the Umurbrogol remained unconquered. The jagged coral ridges, rising 500 feet above the surrounding terrain, contained the densest concentration of Japanese defenses. Major General Roy Geiger, commander of 3 amphibious corps, later called Peleliu the toughest fight of the war. The statistics bore this assessment out. The 1st Marine Division was suffering casualty rates exceeding 30%. Individual companies were reduced to a handful of men, yet Nakagawa's defenders held. They emerged from caves at night to recover supplies, to reposition weapons, to launch counterattacks against exhausted marine positions. During the day, they sheltered deep in the coral, while American firepower pounded the surface. The Corsairs struck these positions with methodical intensity. VMF 114 flew over 60 sorties daily during the peak of the Umurbrogol fighting. Each sortie delivered napalm, rockets, or bombs onto Japanese cave systems. The pilots developed tactics specifically for this terrain. They would approach low, release their napalm tanks to impact cliff faces where cave openings clustered, then pull up sharply to avoid ground fire. The jellied gasoline would splash across the coral, flowing into cave mouths, igniting in massive fireballs that consumed everything within. Sergeant Kunihiko Hara survived one such strike while positioned in a cave halfway up the ridge. His testimony, recorded decades later by Japanese historians, captured the experience. The sound came first, like thunder but continuous. Then the cave mouth turned orange. The heat reached us even though we were 50 meters back from the entrance. Men near the front simply vanished in the flames. Others ran deeper, but the smoke followed. We had to choose between burning and suffocating. Hara's account continued. What broke us was not the fire itself, but knowing it would return. Every day, multiple times. We heard the Corsair engines, that distinctive sound, and knew what came next. You cannot fight airplanes with rifles. You cannot use courage against napalm. We were told American soldiers were weak, that they relied on machines because they lacked spirit. But this was not weakness. This was something else entirely. What Hara described was the systematic application of industrial warfare. The United States military in the Pacific operated on logistical principles that Japanese planners had failed to fully appreciate. The Corsairs striking Peleliu were supported by a supply chain extending across the Pacific to American factories. Napalm, produced in New Jersey, flowed to California ports, crossed the ocean on cargo ships protected by destroyer escorts, transferred to escort carriers offshore, and reached Peleliu's airfield within hours of production schedules determined in Washington. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The production statistics revealed the disparity. By late 1944, American factories were producing over 50,000 aircraft annually. The Vought plant alone delivered 4,000 Corsairs that year. Dow Chemical's napalm production exceeded 14,000 tons. This output represented not emergency measures but standard industrial capacity, the baseline capability of an economy that had converted to war production while maintaining civilian living standards that would have seemed fantastical to Japanese citizens enduring severe rationing. Japanese intelligence had documented American industrial power before the war. The 1941 estimates correctly identified American steel production as 10 times Japan's output, oil production as 100 times greater. But knowing these numbers intellectually proved different from confronting their tactical implications. Statistics about industrial capacity became visceral reality when Corsairs returned for the fifth napalm strike of the day, when ammunition never ran short, when damaged aircraft were replaced faster than they could be destroyed. Private First Class Takeshi Mori, positioned in a cave complex near what Marines called the Wildcat Bowl, witnessed this reality during the second week of October. His position came under attack from Marine infantry, supported by close air support. The Marines advanced slowly, carefully, Mori recalled. When they encountered resistance, they withdrew. Then the Corsairs came. They dropped fire precisely on our positions. The Marines advanced again. If we fired, the Corsairs returned. This pattern repeated all day. They had infinite patience because they had infinite ammunition. Mori's observation captured a fundamental tactical evolution. American forces had developed a system that leveraged their material superiority to minimize casualties. Rather than costly frontal assaults, they used overwhelming firepower to neutralize defensive positions before infantry advanced. The Corsairs provided the flexible, responsive firepower that made this system work. Unlike naval guns firing from miles offshore, fighter bombers could observe the target directly, adjust their attacks instantly, and strike with precision measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. The integration between Marine ground forces and Corsair pilots achieved levels of coordination unprecedented in warfare. Forward air controllers, embedded with infantry companies, communicated directly with pilots overhead, using radio systems that had been refined through 2 years of Pacific combat. A Marine pinned down by a cave position could call in a napalm strike within minutes. The pilot would make a single pass, deliver the fire, and circle back to observe results while the Marine radioed corrections for follow-up strikes. This tactical flexibility represented another dimension of American material superiority. The Japanese military's rigid command structure, where initiative was discouraged and orders flowed down in strict hierarchical chains, could not adapt quickly to battlefield developments. The American system, by contrast, empowered junior officers and even enlisted men to call in devastating firepower. A 22-year-old Marine lieutenant could direct Corsair strikes worth thousands of dollars of ordnance based on his judgment of tactical necessity. Colonel Nakagawa recognized the implications. His defensive plan had anticipated American firepower superiority. The cave systems were designed to survive bombardment. The mutually supporting positions could maintain resistance even as individual strongpoints fell. But Nakagawa had not fully accounted for the combination of material abundance and tactical flexibility that American forces demonstrated. His troops could not maneuver because Corsairs dominated the daylight hours. They could not mass for counterattacks because any concentration drew immediate airstrikes. They could only hide and endure. By mid-October, the endurance was failing. Not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage, they had demonstrated extraordinary resilience, but because the material conditions of the battle had become unsustainable. Casualties mounted daily. Supplies dwindled as American control tightened. Medical care for the wounded was non-existent. And above all, the psychological weight of fighting an enemy with apparently limitless resources wore down even the most determined defenders. Lieutenant Yamaguchi, still alive in his cave system 3 weeks into the battle, recorded his thoughts in a diary recovered after the war. "We were told American wealth made them weak, made them dependent on comfort and luxury. But their wealth is what makes them strong. They do not need courage because they have factories. They do not need spirit because they have napalm. We fight with rifles and grenades they manufactured by the millions. What is the meaning of our sacrifice against such abundance?" This realization that material superiority could overwhelm spiritual determination contradicted everything Japanese military doctrine had promised. The propaganda that characterized Americans as soft, materialistic, and lacking warrior ethos had set up expectations that Pacific combat systematically demolished. At Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, Japanese troops discovered that American forces combined material abundance with tactical skill and genuine combat determination. The stereotype of the weak American soldier crumbled in the face of Marines who endured weeks of brutal combat while supported by industrial power beyond Japanese comprehension. The Corsair became the symbol of this reality. To Japanese defenders, the sound of those Pratt and Whitney engines represented not just an immediate threat, but the entire American war machine. Each Corsair embodied thousands of hours of factory labor, represented tons of strategic materials, required support infrastructure that spanned continents. The fact that these aircraft appeared over Peleliu day after day, despite losses to anti-aircraft fire, despite crashes and mechanical failures, demonstrated an industrial capacity that made individual acts of destruction meaningless. American records from Peleliu documented this attrition warfare's asymmetry. The 1st Marine Division expended over 13 million rounds of 30 caliber ammunition during the battle, 1.5 million rounds of 45 caliber pistol ammunition, nearly 700,000 rounds of 50 caliber machine gun ammunition, 118,000 hand grenades, 150,000 mortar rounds. These were just small arms and support weapons, not including naval gunfire, aerial bombs, or the thousands of gallons of napalm. Against this torrent of firepower, Japanese forces had finite resources. The supplies they carried to Peleliu were all they would ever receive. No reinforcement convoys broke through American naval dominance. No cargo aircraft dropped ammunition. The caves contained stockpiles accumulated over months of preparation. But those stockpiles diminished with each engagement, while American supplies flowed endlessly from cargo ships offshore. The mathematical certainty of this attrition shaped the battle's final weeks. By late October, the 1st Marine Division, exhausted after suffering over 6,500 casualties, more than 1/3 of its strength was withdrawn and replaced by the Army's 81st Infantry Division. The fighting continued. The Corsairs continued their strikes. Japanese resistance continued, but now sustained by determination alone, without realistic hope of affecting the battle's outcome. Private Mori, still alive in early November, watched this transformation. "We no longer fought to win. We fought because surrender was impossible. The Emperor's soldiers do not surrender. But fighting without hope of victory, watching friends die for positions we knew we could not hold, this was different from the heroic sacrifice we had imagined. The Corsairs made it different. They turned our courage into futility." This psychological dimension of material superiority proved as important as the physical destruction. Napalm killed through fire, but the endless supply of napalm killed through despair. Japanese soldiers had proven throughout the Pacific War that they would die rather than surrender, would launch suicidal charges rather than capitulate. But the grinding attrition of Peleliu, where death came not in climactic battle but through systematic elimination of defensive positions by overwhelming firepower, corroded even that fanatical resistance. Sergeant Hara described the final weeks. Men began to crack. Not from cowardice, we were beyond fear, but from the meaninglessness of it. Every morning we heard the Corsairs. Every day positions fell. Every night we grew fewer. The Americans did not need to defeat our spirit because they could simply outlast our ammunition, outlast our food, outlast bodies. Spirit cannot shoot down airplanes. Determination cannot neutralize napalm. Colonel Nakagawa held his command until November 24, 1944. By that point, organized resistance had effectively ceased. The cave systems that once held thousands of defenders contained only scattered survivors. Nakagawa, following the samurai tradition he embodied, ordered the regimental colors burned and committed suicide. Of Peleliu's garrison of approximately 11,000 troops, only 202 prisoners were taken, and merely 19 of those were ethnic Japanese rather than Korean or Okinawan laborers. The battle's aftermath revealed the human cost of material superiority. American forces suffered nearly 10,000 casualties, capturing an island 6 miles long and 2 miles wide. The 1st Marine Division was so depleted it would not return to combat until the Okinawa campaign 6 months later. But Japanese losses were total. Virtually the entire garrison was killed. The Umurbrogol, which Marines had nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge and Death Valley, contained caves still sealed with Japanese dead decades after the war ended. Yet Peleliu's strategic significance remained questionable. Admiral William Halsey had recommended cancelling the operation before it began, arguing the island was not essential to the Philippines campaign. History proved him correct. MacArthur's forces invaded Leyte in October, while Peleliu still raged. The airfield that justified the assault provided minimal support. The battle's primary value lay not in strategic position, but in tactical lessons. The integration of napalm-equipped Corsairs with marine infantry operations at Peleliu established patterns used throughout the remaining Pacific campaigns. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, Marine Corsairs flew close support missions from escort carriers, delivering napalm against Japanese positions dug into volcanic rock. At Okinawa from April through June 1945, Corsair squadrons operating from captured airfields provided continuous tactical support, earning the nickname Angels of Okinawa for their effectiveness against kamikaze aircraft and ground positions alike. The tactical refinements continued. By 1945, Corsair pilots had perfected techniques for napalm delivery. They understood how to use terrain to maximize effect, how to time strikes to support infantry advances, how to adjust for wind and target characteristics. The weapon born in a Harvard laboratory and the aircraft designed before Pearl Harbor had evolved into an integrated system optimized for the brutal realities of Pacific combat. The broader implications extended beyond tactics. The American ability to produce, transport, and deploy vast quantities of sophisticated weapons demonstrated a form of power that traditional military metrics struggled to quantify. Japanese planners had understood American industrial capacity in abstract terms. They had failed to comprehend how that capacity would translate into battlefield dominance once fully mobilized and properly applied. The numbers told the story. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,000 military aircraft. Japan produced 28,000. American shipyards launched ships totaling nearly 12 million tons. Japan managed 1 million tons. The United States Army and Marine Corps expanded to over 8 million personnel while maintaining agricultural production, civilian manufacturing, and quality of life that Japanese citizens, enduring severe rationing and constant bombing, could not imagine. This industrial dominance found its expression in weapons like napalm and platforms like the Corsair. But the weapons themselves mattered less than what they represented. an economic system that could produce them in quantity, a logistics infrastructure that could deliver them globally, and a military doctrine that could employ them effectively. Japanese spirit and determination proved inadequate against this combination, not because spirit and determination lacked value, but because modern warfare had become fundamentally industrial. The survivors of Peleliu carried this knowledge forward. Lieutenant Yamaguchi, one of 26 Japanese soldiers who emerged from hiding in April 1947, 20 months after the war ended, spoke rarely of his experience. When he did, he focused not on the horror of combat but on the futility of fighting an enemy with unlimited resources. "We were brave," he said in a 1960s interview, "but bravery alone cannot win modern war. The Americans proved this with their airplanes, their bombs, and their endless fire from the sky." Sergeant Hara, repatriated in 1946, offered similar reflections. "I learned on Peleliu that warfare had changed. The samurai tradition, the emphasis on spirit and individual courage, these belonged to an earlier era. The Americans did not defeat us through superior courage or better soldiers. They defeated us through superior production, better logistics, smarter use of technology. Their Corsairs represented everything Japan lacked: industrial power, resource abundance, technological sophistication, and the wealth to employ them continuously." These testimonies, recorded decades after the battle, revealed the psychological impact of material superiority. The Japanese soldiers who fought on Peleliu had been indoctrinated with beliefs about spiritual power overcoming material disadvantage. The brutal reality of combat against an enemy with effectively unlimited firepower shattered those beliefs. The trauma came not just from the physical experience of combat, but from the collapse of the ideological framework that gave their sacrifice meaning. Private Mori, interviewed in the 1970s, described this disillusionment. "We were told American soldiers were weak, that they relied on machines because they lacked warrior spirit. On Peleliu, I discovered this was propaganda. The Marines we fought were brave, skilled, determined. But more importantly, they were supported by an industrial system we could not match. Every day, their supply ships arrived. Every day, new ammunition, new equipment, new aircraft. We had only what we carried to the island. Once it was gone, we had nothing. This was not a fair fight, but war is not supposed to be fair." The Corsair operations at Peleliu exemplified this asymmetry. VMF 114 flew over 4,000 combat sorties during the campaign. The squadron lost several aircraft to ground fire and accidents, but maintained continuous operations throughout. Damaged planes were repaired or replaced. Pilots who completed their tours rotated out and were replaced by fresh aviators. The system functioned with mechanical efficiency, grinding down Japanese resistance through relentless pressure rather than dramatic breakthroughs. This operational tempo demonstrated another aspect of American material superiority: sustainability. Japanese forces could launch dramatic attacks, could achieve tactical surprises, could demonstrate extraordinary courage in individual engagements. But sustaining operations over weeks and months while maintaining logistics, replacing losses, and preserving combat effectiveness required the industrial and organizational capacity that only America possessed in the Pacific theater. The strategic implications became clear as the war progressed toward its conclusion. The firebombing of Japanese cities using B-29 seconds, dropping napalm-based incendiaries, killed more Japanese civilians than the atomic bombs. The Tokyo raid of March 9–10, 1945, employed over 1,600 tons of incendiary weapons, killing an estimated 84,000 people in a single night. The weapon that proved so effective against Peleliu's coral caves proved even more devastating against Tokyo's wooden buildings. But by that point, the outcome was inevitable. Japan's military capacity had been systematically degraded through 18 months of attrition warfare. The combined fleet lay shattered after defeats at Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. Air defenses had been overwhelmed by American numbers and technology. Industrial production, targeted by strategic bombing and strangled by submarine warfare, could not replace losses. The home islands faced invasion by forces that had perfected the techniques of amphibious assault through 3 years of Pacific combat. The atomic bombings in August 1945 provided the final shock, but Japan's defeat had been ensured months earlier through conventional means. The strategic bombing survey conducted after the war concluded that Japan would have surrendered by November 1945, even without the atomic weapons or Soviet intervention. The systematic destruction of Japanese military capacity and industrial infrastructure through conventional warfare, including extensive use of napalm, had made continuation of the war impossible. For the Japanese soldiers who survived Peleliu and lived to see this conclusion, the lesson was bitter but clear. The mythology of spiritual power overcoming material disadvantage had been exposed as fatal delusion. Modern warfare rewarded industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and logistical excellence. Courage and determination remained necessary but insufficient. The samurai tradition that had sustained Japan for centuries perished in the flames of jellied gasoline dropped from American aircraft. The legacy of Peleliu extended beyond the immediate participants. Military historians studying the campaign recognized it as a turning point in tactics and doctrine. The integration of close air support with infantry operations established patterns that persisted through Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts. The lesson that air power could provide flexible, responsive firepower to support ground forces became fundamental to American military doctrine. The Corsair itself served as a symbol of this evolution. Designed as an interceptor, it had been transformed through operational necessity into perhaps the finest fighter bomber of World War II. The aircraft continued serving through the Korean War, where it flew primarily ground attack missions. The last Corsair rolled off production lines in December 1952, giving it the longest production run of any American piston-engine fighter. Over 12,500 were built, a testament to the design's effectiveness and to American industrial capacity. But for Japanese survivors like Lieutenant Yamaguchi, Sergeant Hara, and Private Mori, the Corsair represented something more personal. It embodied the moment when their beliefs about warfare, about Japanese superiority in spirit and determination, collided with the material reality of American industrial power. The sound of those engines, the sight of those inverted gull wings, the horror of napalm consuming their positions, these memories persisted long after the physical wounds healed. In his final recorded interview before his death in 1991, Yamaguchi reflected on the experience. We could not believe America's endless napalm drops from those Corsairs. Every day they came. Every day they burned our positions. We knew intellectually that America was wealthy, that their factories were vast, but knowing it and experiencing it are different things. To watch those aircraft return hour after hour, day after day, week after week, never running out of fuel or bombs or napalm, that taught us what we had refused to learn before the war began. We were fighting not just American soldiers, but American industry. And that was a fight we could never win. The coral caves of Peleliu, still bearing scorch marks from flame weapons after 8 decades, stand as monuments to this lesson. They mark the point where Japanese military doctrine, built on the assumptions of spiritual superiority compensating for material disadvantage, confronted the industrial reality of American warfare. The collision was not between armies or ideologies, but between fundamentally different approaches to modern conflict. Japan had chosen to fight with courage, determination, and acceptance of sacrifice. These qualities proved insufficient against an enemy who possessed those same qualities supported by overwhelming material superiority. The endless napalm drops from Marine Corsairs demonstrated that modern warfare had become industrialized, that victory belonged to nations that could produce, transport, and employ vast quantities of sophisticated weapons with systematic efficiency. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.